What is up, everyone? It is Rachel. Welcome back to my channel. And so today I have a very exciting video because I am going to be joined by my friend Sarah, who also graduated from Berkeley in May 2020, and we are going to talk all about how to find an apartment, whether you are moving out of your on-campus university dorms or whether you're starting a post-grad job and are looking for housing. And so before we get started, if you are a student applying to colleges this year, you should definitely check out Study Hall College Consulting. It's a team of myself and other UC Berkeley students, where Sarah is also a part of Study Hall College Consulting, and we specialize in reviewing college application essays and consulting one-on-one with students or parents who may have questions. We are also super active on our social media, so you should definitely give us a follow or a like if you want to see extra tips. We post daily tips, researched advice, things like that, so definitely check it out. And if you're looking for even more advice, you should check out our website, because we do have a blog on the website where we post weekly blogs in topics ranging from study advice, college application advice, to college essay advice. So definitely check us out. And so without further ado, let's get started with Sarah. Awesome. So it looks like we are recording via Zoom now, and I'm joined by my friend Sarah. If you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi, my name is Sarah. I am a recent graduate of Berkeley. I graduated back in May, and I studied architecture and minored in Spanish language and literature while I studied there.
Awesome. Yeah. And so I wanted to talk to Sarah today because she has lived in the dorms at UC Berkeley, but she's also lived in off-campus apartments in college. So I have not had that experience being an RA and living in the dorms all 4 years of college. So Sarah, could you give a brief explanation of where you lived throughout college?
So I spent 4 years in college. The first one I spent in the dorms, and that was through, random selection. I had a random roommate, and I spent just that year there in a triple. Then after that, I moved into an off-campus apartment and did that for the next 3 years. And I lived in 2 different places for my second year and then my third and fourth year in college. And the second year, I lived in an apartment probably about a 10-minute walk away from campus. And then the third and fourth years was maybe like a 20-minute walk from campus. So I usually took the bus to school. So it was somewhere that was more in the city area of Berkeley. And I relied on public transportation more than I would rely on walking to campus.
So for finding available off-campus apartments, what's the process for that like? Do you go to like open houses? Are there websites online? Like, how do people even find apartments that are available to rent or lease?
Finding housing after the first year can be especially stressful, I think, for students who go to a university that maybe housing is not guaranteed after the first year. So some places you will get housing in a dorm for all of your, 4 years that you live there, but Berkeley was not that way. So when I went into looking for housing for my second year, I started looking for apartments around, I would say, February during my freshman year. And that was when people started talking about it anyway. A lot of my friends were talking about where they would go. During the time that I lived in the dorm, I became really great friends with everyone I lived with. They're still some of my best friends today. But during that time, they had different places that they were thinking about living for different reasons. My roommate was going into sorority, so she was going to live in her sorority house. And that's something that people do when they go into Greek life. There's actually a house where you can live in, maybe 60 or so people. If you can't do that, like me, I was looking at kind of all different options. So what I did to find housing is I looked online at a bunch of different places. That was Craigslist. Everyone kind of looks there for a lot of different things. I looked there for housing, apartments.com, though sometimes those are really expensive options, but I was looking there. But I would say the most important place to look for me particularly was the Facebook housing page for Berkeley. You should check, to see if your school that you're going into has this Facebook page, just because that's where most people in the community will come together if they're looking for someone to join them, to be their roommate, if they're looking for someone to sublet their apartment, or if they're looking for someone to sign onto their lease, like all together if they're leaving their apartment. So they'll post on there, and it's great because you can sometimes get really great deals. Sometimes you can get things that you might not find elsewhere online. That was one way that I actually ended up looking for apartments. But what ultimately happened was I was looking for a bunch of different places. I was talking to my friends, and the people that I ended up living with my second year were friends of someone that I lived with in the dorm. So it was kind of just knowing friends, talking to people, seeing where there was a vacant space, and then doing it. And I met them beforehand. I talked to them, and I hung out with them, and they ended up being really great people. So I lived with them my second year. For the third and fourth years, it was also kind of a friend of a friend. I actually met my roommates through the first roommate that I met was through my boyfriend's roommate's girlfriend. I started hanging out with her a lot because we were just around in the same place together. And then I was like, you know what? I like you. And then we started becoming friends. And the way that we actually found our other roommate, we had 3 people total, is we looked on Facebook. So we posted on that housing website, and we actually posted a Google form. So we learned a little bit about anyone that wanted to live with us. We talked about ourselves, what we were into, and then we met with those people around campus. And I did a very similar process for actually moving into a new apartment after I graduated. Currently live with 5 of my friends, one of which we found on the Facebook housing site as well. So it's a really great way to kind of shake it up even after your first year, to meet new people that you wouldn't have otherwise met, and to kind of broaden your friend group that way.
So definitely, I do think Facebook is a great way to like find housing and find roommates and stuff. So Sarah, with all of your housing searches, moving 3 times throughout college and post-grad now, what are some of the factors that went into looking for an apartment, like pricing, location, stuff like that?
Yeah, so when looking for housing, there were a bunch of different factors. I would say the main one, living in the Bay Area specifically, housing prices generally tend to be pretty high. And so that was a big thing coming in. I wanted wherever I was living to be, affordable, not only the base rent, but then when you think about utilities, when you think about the money you're spending on food because you're going to be cooking for yourself, transportation if you need to get to campus, things like that. All of that cost kind of then stemmed out into the other things that I needed, one of which being transportation. So I wanted to be really close to campus, so I would not have to get a car. I wouldn't have to really spend a lot of money on public transportation if I needed to. The most important thing was cost, and then second, kind of location of how close it was to campus, just because that's where I was going every day. And for me personally, studying architecture, I was up late a lot of nights in studio on campus. And so that was something that I really wanted to feel safe walking home. That was a big priority for me. And in order to get those, I really needed to kind of love the people that I lived with, just because to get a lower price, you generally need to live with roommates. If you want a single, you can totally get a single. It's just going to be a little bit more expensive to get. So for me, I had no problem being in a double most of my time in college. And I just found people that I really liked and really enjoyed spending time with.
So my next question for you, can you talk a little bit about like what's the process of signing a lease?
Yeah, so the process of signing a lease definitely differs landlord to landlord. So it depends who you're talking with or what organization you're going into. But generally, it's pretty straightforward in the sense that if you see an ad wherever you're looking online, or someone and you get connected with that landlord, you generally are going to take a tour. And right now during COVID, a lot of places have kind of adopted their touring system where they will do virtual tours where you get to go in and they will not be there, but they'll be video chatting you at the same time. Or sometimes they'll let you come in and they'll have a mask, you'll have a mask, everything like that. So basically you'll take a tour, figure out if you like it. You can ask any questions that you would like to ask. This is arguably one of the most important pieces of kind of looking for an apartment, because you get to figure out if there's anything that doesn't feel right, or anything that they're kind of shortchanging you on, or anything that you need to be aware of that you might need to pay extra for later on. So that could, be anything from extra utility costs to, is there parking, or how many people are allowed to live in the apartment. So those are really important to ask, and you should write out a list of questions that you'll ask them beforehand. And usually you can go online or go to, even Berkeley Housing sometimes has some advice articles that tell you what questions to ask when you're looking for an apartment. So another thing that you should look out for when you're looking at apartments is rent control. And this is something that you should definitely ask your landlord or whoever is giving you the tour when you're looking at the apartment, or when you're asking questions. So rent control means that basically a landlord, after your given lease, if you're planning to renew your lease, they can't raise your rent above a certain amount. So that means it's more controlled in the sense that you're not going to get completely bought out of your apartment, seemingly overnight, during that transition from the first or second lease. So if they're not rent controlled, then there's not really any control over that. So you could, your rent could raise $800 and you wouldn't really have any say over it because they can raise it to the market price. But if it's rent controlled, that's a really great protection for you as a renter. And then once you ask those questions and let's say you decide on a place that you really like, usually you'll put in a deposit. And it depends how many other people are looking at the same place that you're looking at. Sometimes it will be more competitive, so the deposit might be a little bit more and they will require it pretty early on, pretty quick. And that deposit will usually come with an application as well. So you'll submit that application. That application will have most of your, some of your financial information, most of your personal information so they can track who you are and things like that. And then if there are multiple people after that same place, you'll kind of go to a back and forth with this landlord to see, okay, who came here first? Do they want it? Generally, it's not going to be the same bargaining process as buying a house, which is great because I was really stressed about that. So generally, it's going to be the posted rent price unless someone really decides they want to pay way more, in which case I would argue that maybe you should look for a different place. You shouldn't have to get into some sort of bidding war over an apartment or things like that. And then once you decide on that, you are kind of in a verbal agreement with this landlord. You will actually sign an official document. So usually that will, be a pretty lengthy document, and that's the lease, and it will have all of the terms of your agreement. So things that you have to abide by, whether it be, drug use in the apartment or whether it be quiet hours or things like that, or extra expenses that you have to pay for like utilities. So you're agreeing to all of those things. You do want to, for the most part, a lot of people get these documents and they don't want to read them because they're so long, but I would highly encourage you to read it because you don't want to sign something that you haven't read, because there could be some things in there that, you accidentally disobey later on, or, you just want to know what you're agreeing to. So then you sign that document. And from there, generally that's months before you actually have to move in. So you can get your keys in that time. Once your lease date starts, then you can move into that apartment.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that sounds like super complicated, but that's all super interesting. You alluded to it a little bit with like the deposit money. And so obviously, like renting an apartment as a young adult, it's probably very expensive, also very expensive in the San Francisco Bay Area if you're looking at Berkeley specifically for college. So how do students typically go about paying for their rent? And also, how does the rent payments work? Like, is it in cash, credit card, Venmo? How does that work?
Yeah, so this is something that will also differ based on the apartment that you're going into, but generally a lot of college students are having their parents pay for where they're living. And so that's something that's important to know. When you do sign a lease, you're usually going to also get an addendum, which has a guarantor lease agreement. And that's where your parents will sign it. That's where they're going to give their account information, because some apartments will require, a base income that students may not have because you're studying at the same time. And so your parents having that income will make it so you have maybe the right credit report, the right credit score. There are some apartments that don't require you to have a certain income. So sometimes the income is required that it be 2 times or 3 times the base rent. And so that's something to consider when you're looking at how expensive an apartment is. Sometimes apartments don't have that. So if you're not making that base rent amount, or like 3 times the rent amount, but you know that you can still pay for the rent, that's can be fine in some apartments, but that's something to ask. So when it comes time to paying rent, this will differ between who you're living with and where you're living. But a lot of times there will be an online portal, which makes it really easy. If they do have an online portal, that's great. Usually each person in the apartment can pay their divided amount of the rent. And you don't really have to think about doing the math. Sometimes that's not the case and you might have to submit a paper check. You can do that in a variety of ways. One of the ways I did it with one of my apartments was we created a joint bank account, which isn't really necessary all of the time, but it made it really easy for us to deposit money into the same account and then write one check for everyone in the apartment. A lot of apartments, sometimes if they're older apartments or if they just have management that prefers it that way, they will have you write a paper check. But I would say that that's the most rare out of all of them nowadays. Usually they have an online portal. A lot of students like to actually deal with dividing the rent with Venmo. So they'll have one person deal with the rent every single month and you just Venmo them or you send them a check and they will actually just do it on their end. So that can be really useful, if you don't want to make it really complicated, or if you want to make sure everyone pays the right amount of rent, you just have one person always asking for it. This is also a question that you should ask when you're touring an apartment. How is the rent paid? And that's a very common thing to ask, and all landlords have to, tell you how to do that, or they will tell you how to do that.
All of that also sounds very complicated, so that's like super interesting to learn about. And so like with money also, obviously you pay for the rent for the apartment and utilities and everything, but another added cost is grocery shopping. So how did you all do grocery shopping? Like once a week, did one person go and buy the whole place groceries, or was it like split up usually?
Yeah, so getting groceries definitely depends on where you're living. So if you're living really close to a grocery store, it's going to be a little bit easier to kind of plan your meals, maybe not as far in advance. And so that was actually a luxury I had my third and fourth year living in college. I lived in the city of Berkeley, and I actually lived right above Trader Joe's. So that was super easy for me, and that made planning a lot easier in the sense that, whenever we needed one thing, we could go down there and get it. We would have certain individual groceries that we would buy. If it was, a certain product that I really liked, I would get it for myself and I would pay for it. But then the three of us, when I lived there, we would also do sort of a communal budget because we loved to cook together. So when we did communal meals, we would always save our receipts and pin them up on this communal board. And what we would do is we would mark anything that was individual, anything that I solely would pay for that I was only consuming. And then everything else that we were sharing, we would split up and we would Venmo request one another for that. So that was a tedious process, but it was really helpful. We just always kept the receipts and looked at everything that we were spending. And it was a really great way to actually keep track of the money that I was spending on groceries every month. And I could decide, what I needed to cut out and things like that. But for the second year, so the first year that I lived outside of the dorms, it was a little bit different. And I had to take the bus to go to a grocery store every single time I wanted groceries. It was about a 20-minute bus ride, I would say. So that took a little bit more planning. I would have to, hike my bags up the hill when I was done. And it wasn't bad, but it would definitely required me to think about, okay, what are the products that I can buy and keep for a really long time? What are the things that I'm going to have to keep going back for every single week? And so when I did live further from the grocery store, we actually mostly did individual groceries. So we shared some things, if we decided to at one time or another, but we didn't cook together as much. So that was easier in the sense that we weren't really breaking up receipts or anything like that.
Okay, yeah, awesome. That's a lot of really great advice. So, Sarah, my final question for you is, do you have any final tips for students?
When looking for off-campus housing, I think there's a bunch of things, to take into account. As you probably hear, it might feel overwhelming. Some tips would be to, one, really think about your priorities in terms of who you want to live with. If you really, really want a single, maybe start saving more money right now just because it does cost a little bit more. So think about, what is really important to you, what you might be able to sacrifice just to get a better price or things like that. And then I would also say when you're looking for apartments, start early. Like I said, when I was looking for an apartment for my second year, I started around February. Sometimes people start even earlier than that. That's not necessarily, needed, but start early if you can. Even if you're not going to sign a lease until April or May, just having those feelers out there and seeing what's out there will definitely give you a better chance to make a well-informed decision just because you've seen a variety of places. Usually a lot of places don't start going on the market until April or May, but sometimes you'll find that gem in February or March and then you're set up for the next year. Usually leases are about a year long. Sometimes they're different, but usually it's a year. So you'll be set up. So also when you're looking for apartments, I should say an important part of that is knowing who your landlords are in the area. And you can find that out in a variety of ways. UC Berkeley was pretty helpful in the sense that they also give advice on, what to look for, what questions to ask, maybe some notorious landlords around the area that might not give you the best deal or might, shortchange you in the end. You can look towards your university for resources like that. Or let's say you have a Facebook page, definitely ask around there. In the community that you're living with, in that university community, there's going to be people that have experience with landlords that are maybe not the best landlords to live with. And I would definitely check that out just because it's always great to have more information before you sign a year lease and it's on paper and you can't really do much about it. So definitely do your research beforehand and kind of figure out if there are any landlords that have a reputation that you maybe don't want to go forward with.
Yeah, 100%. I think talking with like older students who have like gone through that process also is super helpful as well. So that was my last question for you, Sarah. Thank you so much for coming on here and doing this video with me. Definitely a ton of great advice. So if you have any questions for Sarah about finding an off-campus apartment, definitely leave a comment down below. Or if you wanted to talk with Sarah one-on-one, you should definitely check out our Study Hall College Consulting website, and then you can talk with Sarah via a consulting call so she can give you a lot more great advice. So that is the end of this video. Definitely give it a big thumbs up if you enjoyed watching it, and definitely make sure you subscribe to my channel if you want to see more. I post every single Sunday and Wednesday at 11 a.m. Eastern time, so check back then. But thank you so much for watching, and we will see you all next time.